It's so incredible to see a like an Asian game, and for me, like a Chinese game, and one that's about the North American experience get so much attention. Like that's amazing, and it once again shows that like people care about these stories. For all the people who said like nobody wants a game about Chinese people, like no, clearly people want this game, and so like big ups to you for for working on this, and Senfung for putting all of this together and assembling like a dope team. All the different writers are just incredible. I'm looking forward to an eventual sequel to Jiangshi, Blood in the Banquet Hall. Maybe it's one set in the modern age, and instead of doing like Knights Black Agents, it's just like Dim Sum and Dragons or something like that.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
That's a great title.
Yeah, Dim Sum and Dragons. It's a game
Ooh.
about dim sum restaurants that are actually specialized like facilities for these secret agents who are actually actually built these restaurants above these portals to other dimensions. And these Chinese
Grab your
restaurant
notebooks.
owners, grab your notebooks, and these Chinese restaurant owners are actually like agents who are fighting back these interdimensional horrors.
That'd be amazing. Please, someone make
Dim Sum and
that.
Dragons. Chicken feet in the entrance hall. There, that's the thing. That's the thing.
That's the
I love
intro adventure.
I watched this really great video by the Fung Bros. They're these like American like YouTubers, Chinese American YouTubers, and they did this video about Western Chinese food in like LA, I think. And they went to this restaurant that does boneless chicken feet.
What? How?
Yeah, and they actually
What?
have like the grandma at the back of the restaurant who's just like deboning these chicken feet real fast, and
my
I didn't even
goodness.
know you could do it that fast.
Whoa.
I also don't like to eat chicken feet because it's just so much work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work
Yeah.
for not a lot.
Yeah.
Same
What's
with pig
your-
feet.
Yes.
Oh yeah. What's everyone's favorite style of chicken feet?
Oh,
I
snap.
have I haven't had chicken feet in a long time. It's not something you see in the on the menu too often. The last time I remember having chicken feet was when I was a kid. I remember eating them and loving them because they're like super saucy, basically a vessel for sauce for me. And then when I was done, I took all the bones and I had left enough like cartilage and stuff for the feet to like still remain the feet. And then I went up to my little sister and I put both feet on her shoulders behind her, and she freaked out and I got in a ton of trouble. That's my chicken feet story.
Nice.
Okay, so so if Steve hasn't eaten chicken feet, sorry, I'm imagining you when you were selling that story. I thought you were gonna say I went up behind her and then I put both of the chicken feet on one shoulder as if she were a pirate and it was a parrot. I thought that's what you were gonna say. Okay, so if Steve, you haven't eaten chicken feet in a long time, perhaps we should rephrase to what is everyone's favorite Asian food?
Ooh.
And I guess since we're talking about Jiangxi blood in the banquet hall, maybe we should talk about what's our favorite Chinese dish.
Hmm.
What's our favorite Chinese dish, if we've got one? And that's a tough question. For me, I'll start with one of mine. It's xiaolongbao.
You took
Ooh.
mine.
We could have the same one, Ting. We could have the same one. I was in Shanghai and I was like living alone in Shanghai and super lonely. And I went to this the Yuyuan Gardens in Shanghai. It's like a really famous tourist destination, and there's a famous xiaolongbao place there. And I went there and I bought a stack of xiaolongbao in like the big steamers. I think I had like 4 of them, and the one that I had was pork and crab meat with crab roe stuffed into the folds.
That sounds
Yeah.
amazing.
So that's mine. What about the rest of you? Ting, I know I stole yours.
Yeah, went to the same place with my dad. I think that place is supposed to be where Xiaolongbao originated, like the
Mhm.
first restaurant to serve it.
Super popular. So yours is Xiaolongbao. How about Banana and Steve? What about you?
So I also spent a long time. I also spent a lot of time in Shanghai. So when I was growing up, my parents and I we would go back and forth between Hong Kong and Shanghai, like when I was younger. And so during the summers, my grandmother would always take me out for like lunch or dinner. And I think one of my favorite dishes would have to be so it's called kofu, but I don't know how to say it in I think it's braised like this is going to sound terrible, but wheat gluten. So it's
Mm.
wheat gluten and it's like in these cubes and it's
Oh,
cold. It's like a
yep.
cold dish and it's got like the black fungus stuff with it with like they're not bamboo shoots. I think there's something else, but
Like black
like
fungus, like the mu'er,
yeah.
wood ear.
That's it. And then yeah, it's just like all mixed together and it's like this cold dish and it's like served on a square platter if it's like fancy. Um, so I think that's one of my favorites and it's vegetarian. So vegetarians,
Mm.
you like that.
I love wood ear. So
Me
good.
too. Yeah.
Okay, so Steve, what about you?
Barbecue pork. Give me some
Mm.
pork with like really crispy skin. I have such good memories of like going to the butcher with my parents in Toronto Chinatown, and just being terrified of like the inside out rabbits and stuff. And like as a kid, you don't fully understand, and my parents didn't really want to explain it. But always knowing that this is the place I want to be because at the end of it, I get a whole bunch of barbecue pork. Um, Now as an adult, I still go to those like same shops. One of them is still the same shop. Um, I still don't speak the language, but I pay in cash, and they're friendly to me.
You speak the language then.
Yeah, I picked up what my parents were doing, and I just copied that, and it's been working out really great for me and my protein intake.
Mm. I used to live in one of my first apartments was in Toronto Chinatown, and I lived right if you live in Toronto and you know this area, I lived a block north on the above a jewelry shop on the west side of Dundas and Spadina, right above a jewelry shop, on the same block as like Long Gong, which is like the local brotherhood. I lived across the street from like the Vietnamese places that are in Chinatown, and literally I would just go across the street, get some barbecue pork, bring it back, and that would be my like part of my food for the week. I ate so much barbecue pork when I lived in Chinatown. So since we can't play Jiangshi, we will conclude the epic story of 88 Noodles. We didn't want to leave you folks without any content on Double Happiness Day. It's August 8th. It's August 8th. We got to do something. So we figured let's pivot. Let's talk to you, Banana Chan, and let's talk about Jiangshi, where the game came from, your inspirations, the process, and we'll tell our own stories. I think all of us have stories that kind of relate to those that you tell in Jiangshi, and that's why I think there's this appeal, right? Even though it's set in like the 1920s, I know there are other settings, but even though it's set in the 1920s, and that's what all I guess the marketing is,
Yeah.
those stories are still very much our stories. So like,
Yeah, absolutely.
how did the project start?
So the project started when, so I guess like backtrack many years ago. One of the first games that I remember playing at a convention, like a small convention, was this game TTRPG where the players have to pick up they have to create their character based on like a Chinese food menu. And so this was like a while ago. Mendez wrote an article on this. And like I've obviously moved on from that. But during that time when I was playing this game, I just didn't have a good time. And, I think it's okay that I didn't have a good time because all this other stuff came out of it. But and I've also like, processed all these feelings, but also uh, that sort of made me want to make a game based around my own culture. And, a game uh, that sort of like talked about like, the things that I was passionate about, but also like, about food, because why not? So there's that. And then later on down the line, I think like a couple of years later, I met Sen. I don't remember where we met. We probably met online or at a convention, but we definitely had a lot of parallels in terms of like stuff that we liked. And like stuff that we were working on as well. I think he was like, really into experimental RPGs and LARPs. And so like that's how we sort of got connected, and we started chatting. Like Sen is obviously very big in the board game industry and like the comic book industry. So it was kind of cool to like be like, hey, I'm working with Sen. And we started going through this like Google Doc sheet and just like planning out all of our ideas. The Google Doc is still a thing, like it's still there,
Mm-hmm.
and we're just like going through all these like different ideas. But one of them was for this. It was for Jiangshi, where it was like, yeah, we should definitely make a game about our own culture and like the stuff that we feel personally connected to, and not let someone who's not from our culture make this game.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I think it's super important to have, if you're like a designer or you're into games, I think it's really important to have someone in your life who you just talk about random ideas with. Like you're going to have ideas that you might not ever make into a game, but it's great having that person to bounce ideas off of. And of course it's something that we talk about. Like Steve, we've been talking about this for, I mean, how long have we been how long have we been streaming? Like 5 months?
4 decades.
4 decades. That's
Feels
how
like
long
it.
it's felt.
Yeah.
And we talk about like, yeah, taking ownership of these stories and creating games about us before people who aren't Asian go and create those games. And I mean, you've done some like incredible stuff, and you're currently working on some other RPGs. I don't know like what NDAs you have, but I mean, you're working on the Dune one, which was publicly announced, and that's super cool.
Yes.
But today's about Jiangxi. So you wanted to, tell an Asian story, and as Asian people, you wanted to, tell your own story. So like, my question is, why did you pick the 1920s?
So we were throwing around the idea of, so there were two answers to that. So we were throwing around the idea of having something um, that was a little further back, so closer to when the Chinese Exclusion Act was like became realized. But then we were thinking, oh, maybe it's like a little too harsh. So let's like fast forward a little bit. After all the terrible things that had happened, like after the Chinese Exclusion Act was made concrete, there was also this other stuff that happened, like the fire, the plague, that all happened in San Francisco. So we were like, okay, let's just fast forward through all of that stuff and sort of focus on like the resiliency of these Chinese immigrants and how like they sort of lived through all this stuff. So that was like one thing that we wanted to focus on. And then in general, in terms of like the 1920s, I think that a lot of people think of that time period as like a glamorous time period, like you know with all the like the media that we see today that's about the 1920s. It's like very glamorous for white people, but not so much for everyone else. So we kind of wanted to discuss our history, and like sort of highlight that it wasn't great for everyone.
So you kind of oh, that's cool. That was it was very calculated when you picking the 1920s, because that's interesting. I never thought about it as a time when like, yeah, white people thought it was really glamorous post World War One. America came in and helped win World War One, which is really not the case. But that's interesting. I mean, for those of you who are watching the stream and you kind of watched our first Jiangshi actual play and thought it was really interesting about how this is a story of a Chinese family. This is a story about a Chinese family living in North America at a time when it was, really difficult to be a Chinese person. So, for a little bit of context, if we're going to look at the treatment of Chinese people in North America, we have to go back to at least 1875, before the Chinese Exclusion Act was even passed. And in 1875, something called the Page Act was basically passed. And this effectively enforced a ban that was placed in 1862 on something called the coolie trade, which would basically said that Chinese people can't be brought to North America, even though Chinese people were coming to the U.S. voluntarily. This act had like extreme repercussions on the Chinese community because it dehumanized the Chinese people and treated them like commodities to be traded. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, and this essentially excluded Chinese laborers from entering the U.S., but it exempted people like teachers, students, merchants, and diplomats in order to protect U.S. trade. So the government kept their interests in mind, but not the interests of Chinese people who were actually coming to the U.S. to try to start a life. And the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't even repealed until 1943. And then the effects of it weren't really undone, at least legislatively, until 1965 with the Immigration Act. So, like, this is a tough time to be Chinese, and you chose, like, really heavy material. But you made a game that shows how resilient the Chinese community is, the Asian community is. We're still here. We're still very much thriving. And I think you did such a good job in making sure players are able to tell these positive stories about resistance, about perseverance, which is why I was super happy to even contribute a little bit to the project. Having read the book now, I think it's incredible. Steve and Ting, like, also please feel free to chime in if you have questions of your own.
Yeah, I'm all elbows right now. I'm jumping in. Jumping in.
Go.
So I didn't want to start off with this because Daniel had already given tons of kudos, but I wanted to share with you some thoughts that other folks have told me when they watched the stream, which I haven't passed on just yet. But paraphrasing here, a lot of people they said in the first 20, 25 minutes as Asian Americans, they felt seen more than any other game they've ever like experienced. Just like the small little pieces there, they were just like this was clearly made by like Asian people who just like get it, and we don't have to like go through all the labor and the effort to like tone our please our tone, make sure that we're like being accessible and that kind of stuff. We can just kind of be Asian and all the complexity and messiness that it is. So huge impact. Still 5 days left in the Kickstarter as of recording this. What I also wanted to share was that, you know, I'm not a big, I don't understand a lot of Chinese history, especially in America. And I even made a mistake in the stream itself where I assumed my character would just be in school. And, you know, Banana, you talked about how, you know, that probably wasn't the case. Like your character, 17 years old, probably wasn't in school, probably had to spend their entire time working at the restaurant. And that was like, that like shook me because I thought about all like the pressure I experienced of like going to school, get really, really good grades, all that kind of stuff. And I know everything is always a result of past of the history. And there is no clear line, just like real life, between historical events and real life. But there are ripples. And I couldn't help but like begin to process, you know, what was it like my parents, my grandparents, when they were going through what it is to be Asian in North America, and how did that affect how I was raised and the lessons I was taught. And it gave me a lot of jumping off points for just reflection, self introspection. So that was amazing. Didn't expect that from the game, but there it was, and it was great.
It made you feel.
Made me feel a lot.
Ting, what were your impressions playing the game?
As a player, just the fact that growing up, my family had a restaurant and I worked there, and seeing the dysfunction of family members working together and then that experience I could bring to a game. That's like this is the first time I could do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really rare when we can actually say like, oh yes, I have this real lived experience that is hyper relevant to a game.
Yep.
And it's really neat. Like, I really want to play this game with my family. Like, I want to go because my parents play TTRPGs now, which is insane to say. But I want to go and be like, Mom, I know my mom grew up in Chinese restaurants in Toronto, like all over the city, and I want to play this game with her. I want to see what that's like. Well, if we get the chance, because my family right now is just obsessed with mahjong. Like we're going tomorrow to go play mahjong for like 5 hours.
Oh my goodness.
Oh wow.
I know, right?
Maybe you need
Well,
to
then again-
make a RPG with mahjong mechanics.
Don't get me started.
But going back to Jiangshi,
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted to focus a tiny bit, actually, on the art. So we gushed a ton about the art when we were seeing it, all the overlays that you kind of made with all the assets from Jiangshi. And if you go to the Kickstarter, you can actually just scroll through, and it's a joy just to scroll through and look at all the images. But I want to start with kind of like the process of, working with your artists and getting this amazing art done. But then I also want to talk, after you finish that, about changes you had to make with your art based on feedback. But if we can start with just like how great the art is and how that came about.
Do we want to talk about the cover? Just all of the things that are going on there. Quan Chai.
Oh my gosh, Quan Chai is incredible. Like, he is just a genius with all of the art. Yeah. So when we approached Quan Chai, this was Sen and I. We had a meeting with him over Zoom, kind of like this, and we proposed to him, the idea of making a cover for the game. And Quan Chai, because he's so good and he's so high in demand, both in the board game industry and also like the role-playing game industry, we sort of had to like pitch it to him. We basically had to say like, this is what it is, this is what we're thinking of doing. And before everything, like he just wanted to hear us out. And once we had told him like what this game is about, he was just like, okay, I'll do it. For him, is like, obviously you sort of have to like make sure that he understands like what's going on, because he can deny a job. And he was just like, if this was made by anyone else, then I'd probably not do this. Or if this was like made by non-Asian creators, and I would probably not do this. But based on like everything that you told me, then that's why I'm taking the job. And so he was onboarded. He did such an incredible job on it. He gave us 2 treatments, and then we picked this one. And there's like so much detail that's in this cover. Like, there's an incredible amount of detail. Like, I think it was like a month after I'd seen the finished product that I just realized that there were flies like next to the Jiangshi's mouth. The Jiangshi's mouth, and I was just like, oh wow, I didn't notice that before. But for him, it was also like, I don't want to speak too much on his behalf, but he told us that it was very personal to him as well. And it was like, I think it was like on Twitter or something, or Facebook, where he was like, yeah, this is like the most Asian I've ever felt making this thing. So.
Yeah, there are so many elements about the cover that I really love. I mean, like, I love how you have all the different roles. There's like the grandma, there's the kid, there's the dad, there's the mom.
There's the baby.
Who's
just chilling there, just looking super upset. It's like, hey, I want attention. Why aren't you paying attention to me? And it's like, we got a business to run. Like, sorry, baby.
I always think that the baby's just like, work harder. Look at that baby's expression. That's what it says. For me, I think the most striking part of the cover is the actual Jiangshi in green behind the family. I like it for a couple reasons. I like it because I like it more that now that I've actually played the game, because you did say that like you can become like a Jiangshi, but you could become human again. Right? So then these monstrous characters are also very much human characters in the game, and that's what that art says to me. I really like that. I don't know that if that was intentional or not, but I think there's just so much good going on with this cover.
Yeah, it's definitely like a movie poster type of cover. I'm definitely gonna print one out and have it hang somewhere.
Yeah, you should. I mean, I got the well, oh my god.
Pledge level.
No, I've got the what's Simu Liu? He's starring in that Marvel movie. Shang-Chi. I get the Shang-Chi vibes from the font, and I love it so much.
Yeah, I'm so glad that we like. You've probably seen like a lot of jokes about like font usages on Asian fonts. Like I'm glad that we worked with Matt and Matthias Benici. He sort of like gave us this treatment, and it looks good. Like it looks like a movie font.
Mm-hmm. That's incredible. Mm-hmm. Like all of the pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other piece. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
So Canadian.
So yeah.
What? Want to go ahead, Ting.
Go ahead, Ting. Yeah.
Okay. I do like that the art is sets the tone for the game. It's serious. It's not silly. Like Jiangshi in movies, it's all the movies I've seen. It's they're comedies. They're not like straight horror movies. In this game, it's not. It's not. It can be funny, but it's not. A silly comedy.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Was that intentional to make it like a more serious game? Whereas, like Ting said, a lot of the Jiangxi movies that come out of Hong Kong are comedies.
So we had a few ideas for this. We wanted to do something that was funny, so it was relatable to the audience. But we also wanted to do something serious. And because it deals with such serious subject matter, we were looking for something that was a little more serious in terms of the artwork.
Yeah. I really liked that the monsters themselves are kind of goofy. They're kind of presented in like a kind of funny way. Like they're hopping vampires. That's pretty hilarious. Which allows the fear and the tension to come from other sources, and I assume that was like something intentionally designed.
Yes.
Steve, way to ask a leading question. wasn't even a question.
No, it's all good. Yeah, I think we wanted to do like several different treatments of this. So if you look at Stephen Wu's artwork, he also did like some treatments of the Jiangshi, and there are some that are a little sillier, and then others that are not as silly. And it goes back and forth between this like ominous vibe to this really creepy thing, because I mean the Jiangshi themselves, like they initially start off as these silly hopping things, but then later on when they gain more superpowers, they also start getting like creepier and weirder. Like they can shapeshift and fly and do all that fun stuff.
So still kind of staying on the art here. There was one piece of art where I know you got some criticism, and I think you changed it, and from what I remember, quite quickly. Could you maybe kind of walk us through what the art was, what the feedback was, how it changed, and what that process was?
Yeah. So initially, when we had the artwork done, it was the men had those Q haircuts, and so we were thinking like for the time period, and I'm going to say that this is partially my fault because I watched a lot of Warrior before then, and then I realized that Warrior
great
is
show.
It's so good, but then I also realized that Warrior is the wrong time period. But anyway, Warrior is like a few years before the 1920s. It's like I think the 1890s or something like that.
Yeah, it's just post the Exclusion Act.
Yeah, so a lot of the artists that we were working with, they had introduced like they had included the Q haircut, and by that time, I think the Q haircut was starting to go out of style. And we wanted to get rid of like, we realized like later on, like after, getting some feedback on it, that it was a sign of oppression and it was like a little too much. And, there is a pretty heavy impact on that. So we decided to get rid of that. So what we did was we just contacted, our artists and told them, hey, can you make these changes? And they were amazing. They just like, did it within a few hours, and that was that.
That's awesome.
Wow.
If any of you are listening or watching right now and you want to, if you're looking for a resource to do this, is there anything that you'd recommend in terms of like that research? I have a recommendation. It's a book called it's just called Chinese Clothing by Hua Mei, and it is a concise history of clothing worn by Chinese people of all social classes across all the various ethnic groups in China. It covers like how they did their eyebrows, their lipstick, how they did their hair, the types of clothes they wear, their underwear, everything. So doing research is so important.
Yeah, it's super important. And also, I think like making changes is a lot easier than people assume it is. I mean, for bigger companies, maybe it's a little harder because of all the red tape and bureaucracy and, all that stuff. But I think when we were approached with feedback, it didn't take that long for us to change it. And it wasn't that much work on our part. I mean, granted, the artists had to do the work. And we just like, we gave them, we paid them a little bit extra for the changes. But I mean, at the end of the day, it really wasn't that much, much of a heavy lift for us.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's super important, talking about, having an artist who is willing to make these changes and adjust. I've got a question just about the components of the game. So I think it's super thought out. I love the dice mechanic, and we gushed about the D8 mechanic and the fours. I thought that was really cool. I have a question specifically about the spirit paper. Mm-hmm. So like in Taoism, like sigil paper is a very important component of practice. Have you put mechanisms in place in the game to ensure that people don't appropriate this spirit paper or, use it in a way that's disrespectful to real practitioners?
Yeah. So the reason why we're calling it spirit paper instead of fu lu or fu is so that there is a bit of a distance between like what it is and, what it is in real life. There's that portion of it, and also trying to stick with like the popular culture, the pop culture way of referencing this thing instead of referencing it through, the way that esoteric Taoism relates to this thing, mm-hmm. or, Shintoism relates to this thing. I think when we're talking about spirit paper specifically, like the mechanic itself, we're hoping that people sort of use it as like a way to, to introduce themselves into like, more, various different ways of like how people play with magic or like, sorcery in general versus like, what we're so used to seeing in Western magic. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I'm a little surprised that no one brought up, like, this is the first time anyone's brought up the Taoist magic stuff. Like, no one really talked to us about that. Like, I think, like, in terms of feedback, like, I was waiting for someone to, like, question that more than anything else. And this is, like, the first time someone's brought it up, which is great because I've been waiting for this.
I've been prepared with this answer. The reason why is because, I mean, you recommended I even read this book, The Tao of Craft, mm-hmm. which mm-hmm. is where I learned about this. It's a question that I've thought about a lot with our Dungeons into Asian series as we kind of figure out what magic looks like in our world. Mm-hmm. And, like Chinese magic and different conceptions of the magical and the esoteric vary from culture to culture. And for us, Steve, you were there for those conversations as we were prepping for Gen Con, and we were talking about what Magic could look like for our Magic user characters. And Agatha brought up a really good point of us having Fulu in the game in a way where it might not actually be respectful towards people who actually use that. And we actually backed away. We made the decision to back away from it and instead go the route of like a fang shui, like an old occultist. Instead, in a practice that very much isn't as dominant or existent as, say, Tao spirit papers. So I've got a question. If somebody is, say, uncomfortable with the idea of using spirit paper, despite the very positive efforts you've made to distance yourself from that practice, while still honoring how they are presented in Jiangshi pop culture, because you always see them with it's like on the face like this. It's very much part of it, and it's in that Stephen Wu piece that we were talking about. If people are uncomfortable with the idea of using the spirit paper, is that an integral component of the actual gameplay itself?
No,
because we haven't touched on it in our play.
No, it's totally optional, and it's up to like the GM's discretion to use it or not. And also in terms of like using it, it's not really a part of. I would say that it's more like a thing to get all the players together as a family, like quote unquote family. It's more of like something to keep them together versus like something that's like supposed to, it's like one holding piece, right? It's like that one holding mechanic that makes sure that like all the players sort of feel like they're in line with one another versus like, all the family drama that people have throughout the game. Like I feel like a lot of the players already, they're pushing pretty hard on their characters with, the different relationships and like the heavy, family dynamics. So I think that's like sort of what the spirit paper was supposed to be for. And I think like with the spirit paper as well, it's sort of, you don't really need it. What you could do instead, like for the GM at least, you could just, ask the players to think about like what's something that's keeping you together instead. So that's basically what the mechanic is. And it can be removed, or if players don't want to play with it, they can just like set it to a side. It doesn't make or break the game.
I think that's super important, because I mean, we've certainly on the stream, on the podcast, we've discussed harmful elements or maybe uncomfortable or tension-inducing elements of games, and it's really comforting to see like, hey, we've taken the measures to make sure this is as respectful as possible, but we've also made this. And I mean, you even admitted you were expecting people to ask questions about this. We've taken this element of the game and made it optional. It's like the tension that Steve, you and I have talked about so much with L5R, and how honor and strife are just built into how the game works. And even though I don't want to have to do that in order to play the game, I have to. Yeah. We have a really good question in the chat. Shadow Uzumaki asked, why Jiangshi in the first place, and were there any other Chinese creatures that were considered?
So for us, the Jiangshi were like a physical manifestation of all the stresses and all the oppression that the characters face, because when you're turning into a Jiangshi, you're losing yourself. And that's sort of like the thing that we wanted to portray. That's why we chose the Jiangshi in general. And also, they're fun. But I think like, the first thing that we wanted to do was to make something that was like life sucking, right? That's like identity sucking. And so we were just like, okay, let's use the Jiangshi. We do have a few other creatures that are in the game itself. Like if you wanted to play with like other creatures, we have just like a quick overview on like what the Mogwai are. and we have like a little bit of like stuff on, you know, it's not really as highlighted, but it's, you know, there is a mention of it. But we talk about like Bakwaiting, and we also talk about the fox spirits, which we don't use their proper name because it's a derogatory term in Cantonese and Mandarin, so we just call them fox spirits.
Hmm. That's really cool. I always thought like the Jiangshi are like, emblemic of that loss of agency because they don't have control, right? And they're being controlled. And it's very much reflective of like, the Chinese communities and these Chinese people who are being, you know, they are losing their agency to the white people of America and to, the American government. They're losing their ability to have their loved ones come to their new lives. They're losing their ability to, run an honest business, as we've kind of talked about in our actual play when that cop came in and Steve had to deal with the cop. Right? I think it's like the perfect choice.
I really like using the Jiangshi for this purpose because unlike like a Western vampire that bites you and does physical violence to you in order to like do you harm, they don't need to actually like break your body. They can just hurt you emotionally and drain you emotionally. And that I think today is very, very relevant. And I think a lot of players, Asian or otherwise, have a lot of stories to tell about their own emotional draining and emotional burdens and how they have to deal with it, and how sometimes the healing process isn't just by yourself. You actually do need to rely on family, maybe chosen family, to kind of recover from that, lest you become, a Jiangshi.
Yeah.
It's also cool because the Jiangshi aren't the only antagonists to the family, right? They are scary, but there is like everyone else, the cop who's hustling you, the people who don't want you in your community in the first place. They don't want you in America, and I think those sentiments are echoed in our own experiences as Asian Americans right now. And I think that super relevant, right? Now, and I know I kind of want to cover like questions that I think consumers might have, because I know that a lot of people have asked you questions. Some of them very thoughtful, some of them, not. Some of them not, and I think you've been pretty public about what people have been saying in responses to that. And you and I, Banana, we've had like private conversations about like how do we deal with these things. And
Yeah.
if you go to the Kickstarter page, what I think is most interesting, and I think what maybe deserves more, spotlight, is the creative team. And I want to bring this up because there are folks on the creative team who aren't Chinese or aren't Asian, yet they're still there. Do you want to like talk about that? Because I know that you had a lot of other people who are just writing other settings and stuff.
Yeah. So we are the reason why we brought on other non-Chinese creators was because we wanted to basically like make Jiangshi like a set, like a mechanical thing, right? Like this is going to be a story that other immigrant families can play with. Like you can have this, we can use this as like a vehicle for storytelling for like other immigrant families and other people of color, and sort of try to use this as like a way to hack it so that you could use your own stories. And so like for this team, like we have a whole bunch of writers for the core book itself. Like we have Daniel obviously and Ross Chung and like um Kiana Shaw and everyone who's like writing all the content about like what's it like being Chinese American, or like the different Chinatowns that we have in US and Canada. but then we also have like Janaea Kemper, who's working on like the social groups at the time. So Janaea is like, super, she knows like a lot about like the history of, different social groups, especially in like the 1920s. So that's why we asked her to be on this project. And so she's working on that. We have Ivan Mendez, Sammy Lai. They're all like consultants, but they're also like writing bits and pieces in the book itself. Kristen Devine, she's worked on a LA based setting because she's from LA. And Sharong's writing a witchy scenario, which is a lot of fun.
That's cool.
Yeah. So every writer is like take their own spin on it. Yoshi Creelman specifically is making a Japanese internment camp version of the game. Carl Pierre Lewis is making a Haitian American setting. And then we also have like all these. Yeah, exactly. I'm super excited for it. We have like all these other writers. Jabari is working. The last I spoke with them, they're working on a. So I don't know if you're familiar with this, but like back in the 80s or back in the 70s when punk was a big thing, a lot of punk bands would actually have shows in Chinese restaurants because those were the only places that they could have shows at. And so there'd be a lot of destruction of property depending on which restaurant it was, but or which bands were playing. And so there's like this whole community there that's like super interesting that not a lot of people talk about. So Jabari's working on a setting for that.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a lot. And Maple's working on a setting for a Filipino American family. Gian and Morgan, I have to talk to them about this, but we're getting in there. And Vladimir is planning on writing a scenario based around the Romani experience.
That's really cool. I think it's oh, Monty has just shared a really good link. I'm actually going to save that for myself in the chat about that like Chinese restaurant and the punk scene. Adam Ali has brought up a really good point in the chat about the story being told by the mechanics. And this is something that I think like folks who work as like cultural consultants or sensitivity readers see a lot. Emma and I recently worked on a product together as consultants. It was like an Asian D&D product. And they wanted to use a lot of the lessons that, Steve and we've talked about with L5R and Oriental Adventures. But what they did was they had this interesting content and the interesting art, but then they just kind of put it on top of the D&D content. So they had this Asian setting, and they were like, then you'll find halflings, gnomes, elves, dwarves, and all of that, where this looks more like an Asian skin on top of a Western European fantasy framework. But Jiangshi, where it's super impressive, and like we've talked about with the dice mechanics, is that, not only is your theme Asian, in this case Chinese American, but your mechanics also reflect that culture. And we need to see that more in game design. And I like this is less of a question, more of like me like talking you up and being like, you're
thanks.
awesome, and you and Sunfilm are awesome for doing that.
Thank you. Yeah, we're hoping that the mechanics themselves are the mechanics themselves I feel like are good for telling the diaspora story, right? Like that's what it's sort of like built to do. I'm not sure if it'll be good for other stories that are not set, in, like if it was like a fantasy setting, I'm not sure if it'll work. Or if it's like, a dungeon crawl, I don't think it would probably work out so well. But I think that, specifically for this kind of experience, it's something that we built around it.
Yeah, that's super cool. Ting, Steve, do you have any questions? Steve, you're muted.
Damn it. every time. I was just so engrossed in the conversation. That's why I was silent. But we talked a little bit about this, and you got a lot of feedback around, a lot of the content here. A lot of it was positive. Some of it was not positive. Could you share a little bit about the non-positive, non-constructive feedback you got and kind of how you handled it?
Yeah. So there was this one person who said that, and I totally understand where they're coming from. We've had some people of Asian descent reach out to us and, have, um, there was a little bit of pushback basically, because some people were saying that it was basically sanctioning racism. Um, and so there are two ways of thinking about this, right? Like one of them is that a lot of the tabletop RPGs that we're familiar with, a lot of people assume that it's D&D and not that D&D is bad. It's a product like anything else, but like, you know, the the thing that like a lot of people are assuming that this is that it's a game that's like that, or like Pathfinder, or like, any other game like that. And I think that like that was one of the reasons why a lot of people were a little hesitant about this game, because when they think about TTRPGs, they don't think about like, storytelling game, or, collaborative, uh, anything really. Just like, they sort of think of it as like, a guided game, that's guided by the GM. Um, and this is guided by a GM, but it's more collaborative than, something like what you would traditionally see, traditionally, quote unquote. And so I think that's a bit of where the pushback came from, a little bit of that. And also, I think we are so used to seeing ourselves like being misrepresented in media in general that, sometimes when we see stuff that's like this, regardless of who creates it, uh, it's probably like in the back of our heads, we're probably thinking, oh, this is going to be bad. And so, like, I think that's also where like the pushback came from, where, you know, and they have no, they don't have anything to go by when it comes to like trusting us. They don't have to trust us at all. But, we did our due diligence. There's like, 4, 5 different, parts with safety in it. There's like all the stuff that we've added in terms of history. It's probably like, I don't know, after layout, it's probably going to be like 30 or 40 pages of history. I don't know. But, you know, we're trying, and I think that and obviously we're open to feedback. We're open to like, critiques. But I think that sometimes it's weird because like when you're getting this feedback from like another Asian person, it sort of feels stranger. Like it feels like a deeper cut.
Mhm.
Um, and for me, at least, like there were instances where I was just like questioning whether or not I could write about this. Like, is this even my own culture? Like, there was this moment in, writing this or like going through this Kickstarter where I was just like not sure if I was allowed to like talk about my, not my own experience, but my own, identity. Like, I was having a little bit of an identity crisis at the time, but it was like things like that, and it just sort of felt like, I don't know, it felt very strange. And I think that this is not the first time that, us as creators have experienced, anything like that. There are other creators out there who've also experienced similar things when they're writing about their own cultures or identities in a game. Like, this is not an uncommon thing. This happens a lot. So I think like talking to other creators of color about this kind of thing, it was super helpful just to
Mm.
like ease out the feelings and
Mm-hmm.
emotions that came out of it.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good takeaway of just seeking out these communities of people of color, for when something like this happens that you maybe think you might be prepared for, but when it actually happens, you find yourself reeling, finding yourself lost, low on energy, confused. Being able to go back to a community like that and speak your emotions, however raw they might be, and allowing others to kind of chime in with their own experiences and how they've dealt with trauma in the past is a very powerful human experience. And I'm happy that you kind of shared that.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I noticed when, when I posted about this, like on social media, like in my private social media thing, like I noticed that there were some, white creators who were chiming in and were just like, oh yeah, I've experienced something similar with my Kickstarter where, people would be complaining about shipping or, the components or something like that. And no, it doesn't feel like that. It's, it's your identity that's being questioned, not the components of a game that's being questioned. So I think it is a lonely experience until you find other people who are dealing with similar things or who have dealt with similar things. And yeah, it's a strange place to be.
Yeah, I feel that. We're closing in on that 1 hour mark.
Oh, sorry, everyone.
No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry at all. You've just provided like our audience with just like an incredible amount of insight into how much work, how much research, and how much preparation it takes to actually pull off something like this, and design a game like this, and it's a wonderful game. I want to like close off and just say like, hey, there are like, as of this stream, there are 5 days left in the Kickstarter. It's been funded, but we need to cross 100K in US dollars, not our polar Canadian dollars.
Oh no.
Oh no. So, Jiangshi Blood in the Banquet Hall is still on Kickstarter for the next 5 days. If you're interested in, these stories of perseverance, stories of resistance, stories of, most importantly, family, check it out. Steve's just linked it in the chat. I like Banana. I'm always grateful for when we get to talk. I'm grateful for you including me in this project. I'm grateful for you taking the time to just play this game with us and talk to us about this and just be open about your experiences as a creator. I think more people need to do that, and I'm so happy that we got to do this on August 8th, Double Happiness Day. So let's start with you, Banana. Where can people find you on the internet? Your Twitter handle's already on screen, but if you've got websites, anything like that, where can people find you?
So I am always on Twitter now because Facebook is a mess. But you can find me at Banana Chan Games on Twitter and Instagram. And you can find my company, Game in a Curry, which is the co-publisher for this game, at Game in a Curry on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram.
Nice. And then Ting, thank you so much for joining us as a member of this panel, this discussion, this interview, but also in the actual play and just being a member of our community. Ting, where can people find you on the internet? Do you have anything going on right now in the games world or beyond that you want to share?
Thanks for having me. Twitter, Instagram, the Ting 1000, also Twitch. I get into streaming sometimes. They'll be playing in a Fiasco one-shot on coming up Wednesday night on the Utopia channel.
Dope.
Yep.
That's awesome. Okay, so that's Utopia TV on Twitch. So check that out. They're doing some amazing stuff, and Jess and Miriam put something together that's just incredible, and they did so much during Gen Con. It was awesome.
Yeah.
Steve, what have you got going on? You, best-selling, Emmy award-winning author, podcaster. What have you got going on?
Right now, Steve just taking care of himself. If you want to reach me out, reach out to me. This was an emotional stream. I got a lot of emotions going on. No, don't apologize.
Never apologize. Never apologize for that.
A little bit tearing up there too earlier.
I feel that. But you can catch me on Twitter at DEEEM Steve, DM Steve phonetically. I'm just going to focus the next little bit of my energy on some gyms that might be opening up, working with my old crew. We got to make sure our bodies are healthy, just like our minds and souls are healthy. That's going to be an effort, though. We got to work back on that, but it's important to us.
Mm-hmm. And if telling Asian stories is important to you, or you're into like D&D and Pathfinder and all of that stuff, and you want to tell an Asian story, or you want to tell an Asian story using a different game system, you can head to unbreakablerpg.com. We're getting good at these segues, Steve, talking about Unbreakable. You can head to unbreakablerpg.com and you can buy Unbreakable Volume 1, which is an anthology of D&D 5th edition adventures written and edited and illustrated by Asian creators. If you want to participate in Unbreakable and you want to write for Unbreakable Volume 2, scroll to the bottom of the page at unbreakablerpg.com and there's a link, there's a form that you can click on. If you're first-time author like Steve was, if you're an editor, if you're an illustrator, fill out that form, participate in volumes 2, 3, 4, 5, however many the Unbreakable crew decides to do. It's just as important as I think, like Banana, I think you've done such an incredible job with, you and Senfung have done such an incredible job with Jiangshi and just putting Asian stories out there. For those of you who are in that fantasy space, unbreakablerpg.com. Follow Asians Represent. We're at AZNS Represent on all social platforms except for Twitch, where we are AZNS Rep. It's a long story. I've got something going on. I am currently in the works of publishing Volume 2 of my Denizens of Mountains and Seas zine. It's an OSR Chinese monster manual. So every single volume I put out 8 Chinese monsters from classical literature with stats, history, and context on how to use them in your games. And you can find all that content on my Patreon at patreon.com/Daniel H. Kwan. Banana, thank you so much for being an amazing guest. Ting, thank you so much for being a part of our interviewer panel. And thank you, viewers, listeners, for joining us for this very positive yet very emotional stream. And I love all of you for that. This was incredible. That being said, everyone else, please take care, spend time with your family, and you know what? Go support your local Chinese restaurants. Go do that if you can. Safely. Wear a mask, Uber Eats, whatever you want to do. Take care, everyone. Bye.